There we go. And I will begin just by officially welcoming Professor Jeffrey Veidlinger, who is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. I went to Northwestern University, but Big Ten rivalries should not extend that far. I'm glad to have you. He's the author, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 1921 and the Onset of the Holocaust, and is the award-winning and other books, award-winning books, The Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Jewish Public Culture in Late Russian Empire, and In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small Town Jewish Life in the Soviet Union. He's the editor of Going to the People, Jews and Ethnographic Impulse. He is the chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, and a member of the Academic Committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So Professor Veidlinger, we are delighted to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, for giving us an overview of the history of the Jews of Ukraine, with an eye towards helping us to understand what is unfolding in Ukraine at the current moment.
Thanks. So thanks a lot for having me. And I am, as I'm sure you all are, very concerned about what's going on right now in Ukraine and about the Russian aggression that we're seeing. I have friends there. I have academic friends there, like me, who teach at universities that are now wearing camouflage and leading brigades on the street with machine guns. And one of my friends there just posted that one of his friends was killed just a few hours ago fighting. And these are, again, people who a week ago, 2 weeks ago, were teaching at the university and, you know, having no role whatsoever in any military conflict. So it's really an absolutely terrible conflict going on there. And it's terrible conflict for everybody. Actually, I shouldn't call it a conflict. It's a war. It's an outright war, and it's a war of aggression. It's a one-sided war of aggression, of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about my experiences in Ukraine. I've been there about 10 times, most recently right before the pandemic when I was teaching over the summer in Kyiv. And I'm happy to talk about that and the work that I've done there, and the work I've done with the Babyn Yar Historical Museum. I actually just had a meeting yesterday. I'm on an editorial board with the Babyn Yar Historical, a journal that comes out of the Babyn Yar Historical Museum. And the editor was speaking to us from a military training camp where he's currently working. And of course, we weren't talking about the journal much, but we're just talking about his safety and the safety of others that we know. I have another student who is there, a young Ukrainian woman who's a student who works on sexual violence during the Holocaust. And she has left her husband and fled with her 4-year-old child to Poland, and was writing about what a difficult decision that was to leave her husband in Ukraine and flee to Poland. So this is an absolutely terrible situation going on. We haven't had a ground war like this in Europe, certainly since World War II. And I really do feel for the people there. And I hope that, you know, you do as well and can do what you can to donate to civil society, to the JDC, to whatever, the Joint Distribution Committees, the JDC, whatever it takes. So I have a few things I can talk to you about, and I haven't actually prepared anything, but I have a few things that I can talk to you about. One, and you can let me know which you would prefer. One, I can give you a general overview of Jewish history in Ukraine for a little bit, and then talk about the current conflict. But I don't know what people know. People don't really know anything about Jewish history in Ukraine? I'll give you a little bit of that overview. I see the rabbi nodding, yeah. And then I can also show you, I've been a part of a project. The reason I've been to Ukraine for about 10 times or so is I was part of a project that interviewed elderly Yiddish speakers throughout Ukraine about their lives, about how they survived communism and how they survived the Holocaust. And we interviewed about 450 people over 10 years. And I have video of that. I have the entire video collection, with about 800 hours of video, is all online. But I've also got curated videos with subtitles of little clips that I can show you. So I'd like to show you a few of those as well to give you an idea of the people in Ukraine. I think the best way for me to talk about the history of Jews in Ukraine in total and in sum is with maps. So I'm going to share a screen to put a few maps on, if that's okay. And stop me, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, or stop me if you're not so interested in this part. And I could talk for hours about Jews in Ukraine, and I can talk about different aspects of it. So let me just get those maps up, and I think this will do it, and see if this will help. So do you see these maps here? Do you see a map right now? And I can just try to make it full size. Okay, do you see a map now? Yeah, okay. So this is a map of what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is why Jews got to Ukraine in the first place. There were actually Jewish settlements in what is now Ukraine since antiquity, because Jews had settled on the northern coasts of the Black Sea, areas around Crimea, actually, which is now under Russian occupation and has been since 2014, but was a part of Ukraine since 1954. And Jews had settled in Crimea since antiquity. But more recently, or at least in the 13th century, is when most Jews started to arrive in Ukraine. And so I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
And I don't want to divert us too much, but my own curiosity, we have in our community, Eric and Carol Myers, who are biblical archaeologists, and they told me that there is right now a dig under their auspices taking place in Ukraine that they may trace back to after the Second Temple period. Mm-hmm. Did Jews go back? You said in antiquity, but how far back does the Jewish presence there go, according to your knowledge?
It goes back to before the time of the Common Era. So we have, back in the BCE, we have Jewish settlements or settlements of Jews that were probably, we don't know all that much about it, and they may know better, but there's settlements of Jews really going back as far as we can go back, as far as the history of Ukraine, as far as there are, any evidence of human settlement. There were Jews there on the northern coast of the Black Sea, but just in that tiny sliver of the northern coast of the Black Sea. And a lot's been made of that because people talk about this ancient Jewish presence in Ukraine. It's true, but the vast majority of Jews arrived in the 13th century, or beginning in the 13th century. And they arrived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is what I have the map of up here. And you can see, I don't know how well you can tell from this map, but the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the largest countries in Europe in the 16th century. And between the 13th and the 16th, really between the 13th and the 18th century, it grew into one of the largest countries in Europe. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or what we can call just Poland, was one of the most advanced countries in Europe. It was advanced intellectually, it was advanced economically, and it was advanced politically. It actually had elected kings. When a dynasty died, all of the nobility, which was about 10% of the population, would get together and they would elect a new king. And it had a parliament, and the parliament, no new laws could be passed without the approval of the parliament. So it was a very advanced politically society, and it attracted Jews. They were interested in bringing Jews into Poland, which at the time included much of Ukraine. The kings were interested in bringing Jews to Poland in order to stimulate the economy. So they issued all types of privileges to encourage Jews from the Rhineland to come to Poland. And at the time, Jews in the Rhineland were being discriminated against. There were the Crusades against the Jews of the Rhineland. There were expulsions of Jews from the Rhineland. I don't know if you can hear that dog barking in the background, but nothing I can do about that. That's Phoebe, and there's probably a dog walking by outside. But Jews were encouraged to come to Ukraine and to Poland from the Rhineland in the 13th century, and the kings encouraged them to come and gave them broad privileges. And one of the major privileges that the kings gave them was that if the Jews settled in Poland and Ukraine, they could get their own they could run their lives according to their own legal system. And so Jews got autonomy of law, which meant if there were any disputes between Jews, it could be settled in Jewish courts according to Mosaic law. They wouldn't have to go to the Christian courts. And this was a major privilege and a major reason why Jews were attracted to Poland. Jewish communities in Poland also had means of facilitating disputes between communities in this organization called the Council of Four Lands. And the Council of Four Lands was essentially a mini Jewish parliament where all of the Jewish communities would get together and would send representatives to the central parliament. So it was in a way what was criticized as being a state within a state, but in some cases really was a state within a state. It was a way that Jews could administer their own affairs within Poland. So the bottom line is that Poland was very welcoming to Jews in the 16th century. And I know that's not the reputation it has now, Poland and Ukraine, and there's good reason that that reputation went away. But there's a reason why the largest Jewish community in the world was settled in Poland. Most Jews in the Holocaust were killed in Poland and in Ukraine, in this region. And the reason is because that's where they were settled, because life was good for them at an earlier period. So, and this is the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You can see this is Poland over here in the purple, and the yellow area and the pink area is what is now, or most of the yellow area and pink area is what is now Ukraine. And you can see Kiev is right over here. This all came to an end, this golden age of Jewish life in Poland, in the 18th century, when Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany all partitioned Poland into different regions. So now you can see what happened. The entire country was wiped off the map and would remain off the map until 1919. The entire Polish country was wiped off the map. And the part with the largest number of Jews is this yellow part that came under Russian rule. So between 1772 and 1795, about 3 million Jews found themselves under Russian rule. What's significant about that is prior to that, Russia did not allow any Jews in Russia. Russia had a complete no Jews policy. No Jews were allowed in Russia. There were some exceptions, some Jews managed to get in, but for the most part, Jews weren't allowed in Russia. And then suddenly Russia conquered this area and found itself with the largest Jewish population in the world. So literally within a day, Russia went from having no Jews in its empire to having the largest Jewish community in the world in its empire. And the Russian Tsar's solution to that was not to let the Jews come into Russia proper, come into old Russia. So they set up this line, and you can see it here in purple, and said, all of the Jews that we've conquered, you have to stay in this region where you are. You're not allowed to come into Russia proper. And that became known as the Pale of Jewish Settlement. So the Pale of Jewish Settlement, which people often talk about as a vast ghetto, is an area to which Jews were restricted in the Russian Empire. And people think of it as a very repressive measure. And again, as I said, a vast ghetto. I just want to point out that this ghetto was about 2.5 times the size of California. It really was a huge space. And in fact, Jews could travel throughout the Pale of Jewish Settlement. They just couldn't leave it. This is a country in which about 70% of the population of Russia were serfs, which meant they were tied to the land and were not allowed to leave the farm on which they were born. So Jews actually had a lot more freedom of movement than others. I don't know what's going on with my dog. She's usually quite quiet. Give me a second. I'm just going to deal with her and take her outside.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. I mean, we can go off mute now for a second.
For a moment, it is. It's nice to be able to bring everybody together. All right.
I'm back. What'd you say about me?
We were just schmoozing. We were having schmooze.
Yeah, good.
If I could interrupt for a moment, those of us who have dogs had full sympathy for you.
Yeah. Sorry about that, though. But for those of you who don't, I'm sorry. Anyway, the Jews, where was I? The Pale of Jewish Settlement. Right, so the Jews were in the Pale of Jewish Settlement. And for most of the time that they were there, it wasn't all that bad because it's where they were living anyway. So they had to stay where they were living anyway. Russia, most people weren't allowed to leave the farm on which they were born. So Jews had a little bit more freedom than that. And this western part of Russia was really the most advanced part of Russia. It was the most European part of Russia. It was the most technologically advanced. It was most intellectually advanced. There's really no reason why anybody living in even like a backward town like Berdichev, a shtetl like Berdichev, there's no reason why they would want to go to Kaluga, for instance. So there wasn't much need for the Jews to go to the interior of Russia. And I should say there were a few cities in Ukraine or in this Pale of Jewish Settlement that were off limits to Jews, and one of them was Kiev. And Kiev, Jews weren't allowed in the city of Kiev until 1917. So the Jews are living in this area, and this is the area, the Pale of Jewish Settlement, where really Jewish life as we know it began. This is where Jewish literature in all of its different forms began. Maybe I'll just stop sharing the map for a minute because I don't really need it right now. But it's where Jewish literature in all of its forms began. It's where the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik was born, and Hebrew poetry, Hebrew writing, the revival of the Hebrew language began in the Pale of Jewish Settlement and largely in Ukraine. It's where the Yiddish writer Sholem Lechem lived most of his life, and all of his stories were set in Ukraine. Tevye the dairyman was a Jew who lived in Ukraine. I'm sure you've seen Fiddler on the Roof. That all takes place in Ukraine. And Russian Jewish literature also began in Ukraine. Isaac Babel is probably the most famous. Vasily Grossman is another, but very famous Russian Jewish writers were also writing in Ukraine. So this whole flourishing of Jewish culture that took place in the 19th century began in Ukraine. It's really where Jews can date that. The Hasidic movement began in Ukraine. The Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of Hasidism, was from Ukraine. He was from the town of Medzhibozh. And his chief follower, Dov Ber of Mezerich, was also from Ukraine, from the town of Mezerich. Some of you may have heard of Nachman of Bratslav, who is was a mystic Hasidic leader, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And he still has a group of followers who come to his grave in Uman in Ukraine. Bratslav is in Ukraine and Uman is in Ukraine. So he lived his whole life in Ukraine as well. Even Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Rebbe, the Chabad Rebbe, was born in Ukraine. So Ukraine is also the place where so much of modern Jewish religion, or at least of modern Jewish Hasidic religion, which is a big part of Judaism, originated. Ukraine is also where modern Jewish politics originated. And in many ways, it started because of violence against Jews. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'll talk about that now. There were a series of pogroms against Jews beginning in 1881 in the modern period. And this led to the establishment of modern Jewish politics. So just to tell you what happened, in 1881, the Tsar was assassinated. Alexander II was assassinated, and Jews were blamed for his assassination because there was one Jew who was involved in the plot to assassinate him. And there's a tendency in that part of the world to blame Jews whenever anything goes wrong. And in 1881, there was the Tsar was assassinated, and on the Easter holiday, there were rumors that Jews had killed a Christian child to use his blood for ritualistic purposes that led to a series of pogroms against Jews. And these pogroms that resulted in the deaths of a couple dozen people between 1881 and 1882 resulted in a real crisis among the Jewish community. That crisis was furthered when the government responded to the pogroms by blaming the Jews for the violence and putting more restrictions on the Jewish community. So in 1882, the government of Russia issued the so-called May laws. And those laws said that Jews aren't allowed to settle in the villages because they're corrupting the peasants. Jews have to remain in medium-sized cities. The Jews aren't allowed to go into the universities. Jews aren't, there are quotas on Jews in the university. All types of restrictions were placed on Jewish life. And this really led to a reckoning within the Jewish community of people saying, we're never going to get emancipated here. This is the world's largest Jewish community. And they started to believe that they can't just wait for the Tsar to give them rights. They need to emancipate themselves. And the person who said this was a famous doctor who was the editor of a Russian language newspaper named Leo Pinsker. And he wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation. And Auto-Emancipation, I think, is one of the foremost texts of modern Jewish writing, published in 1882 after these pogroms. And he said the Jews will never be accepted as Russians, or for that matter, as Germans or as Frenchmen, until they have a state of their own, until they have a land that they can call their own. And this is the origins of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement begins with Leo Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation.
Can I interrupt you with a question?
Sure.
Take a little prerogative. So we know that in France, there's been an emancipation of French Jews that's taken place in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Has any of that politically made its way to all the way to Ukraine? To what extent, is there a national movement that the Jews were offered to be part of, or that hasn't really impacted the community there yet?
Yeah, so the Jews are emancipated in France in 1789 and 1791, really in 1791. And then subsequently in some principalities in Germany in the early 19th century. And yeah, so Pinsker believes that the same thing is going to happen to the Jews of Russia eventually, and believes that they can wait for the Tsar to emancipate them like Napoleon emancipated the Jews in Western Europe. But with auto-emancipation is him saying this isn't going to happen. We can't just sit there and wait. There's another component, though, that happens in Ukraine in particular with writers like Shimon Dubnov, who's a historian and a thinker at the time. And he points out that the emancipation of the Jews in France wasn't a real emancipation, he says. All it did is it said that Jews are emancipated as individuals, not as Jews. So there was a deal that the Jews of France made, which is they're going to get equal rights to other French people, but they have to give up elements of their separateness. And Dubnov and others in Ukraine said this is too much of a price to pay. For instance, they had to give up Mosaic law. They had to agree that disputes between Jews are going to be settled in the French civil courts or in the German civil courts. And, we now as American Jews think, well, obviously, we're going to be subject to civil law. But particularly for Jews in Ukraine and Poland, where they had a history of autonomy and where they had a history of settling disputes between themselves according to their own system of law, this was anathema, because what's Judaism if it's not halakha? So sure, you can stick on a kippah and you can go to shul on Saturdays, they're saying, or even on Sundays, as some Reform congregations were doing in Germany. But that's not Judaism. If you've given up Judaism is not just a Saturday religion. Judaism is a whole way of life, a whole structure of a way of life with a system of laws. If you've studied Talmud, you know that the transactions, civil transactions between individuals are regulated according to halakha. And they thought, Dubnov and others thought that this was too much of a sacrifice that the French made. So even that type of emancipation they didn't believe in. And this is a whole nother realm of Jewish politics that originates in 1881. And then the other realm of Jewish politics are those who think that we got to just get out of here. And they flee by the masses to America predominantly. And this is the beginning of mass migration to America between 1881 and 1924, when the border is closed, is when most of you can probably trace your ancestry in America to that period of time. It's also when Jews started to try to go to Palestine in very small numbers, but in numbers that have a significance later on. And it's also when Jews try to leave and start to want to go into the interior of Russia. So this is the first time that a Jew from the Pale of Settlement would want to go to Moscow or St. Petersburg, because now they're sick of this violence that's taking place in Ukraine. So this is when the Pale of Jewish Settlement and the limitations on Jewish residency become a problem. And then another thing happens after 1881, which is a lot of Jews start to join revolutionary movements and start to come to believe that the Jews will only be emancipated when the rest of humanity is emancipated. And Jews flock in large numbers to socialist movements that are trying to overthrow the Tsar and to put in a new system in place in Russia. So there's this level of violence. And then what we see is every 20 years or so, there's another outbreak of violence in the region. Between 1903 and 1906, there's about 3,000 to 5,000 Jews who are killed in another wave of pogroms, which comes about also because of political collapse related to Russian war with Japan. And then right after World War I, there's another wave of violence. And this is what my latest book is about. Between 1918 and 1921, over 100,000 Jews are killed in pogroms in Ukraine. It's a staggering figure. I just want to point that out, 100,000 Jews killed between 1918 to 1921. And the book that I just wrote argues that this is a real precursor to the Holocaust. And we see that in the reaction of people at the time who are saying this is the beginning of the physical extermination of the Jews of Poland and Ukraine. And there's articles, I have an article in the New York Times saying 6 million Jews in Poland and Ukraine are now slated for extermination, for physical extermination, unless drastic action is taken immediately. And that's what they're saying in 1919. So this is the beginning of real mass violence against Jews. And it's perpetrated against Jews for a wide variety of reasons. There's a whole civil war going on with different sides fighting each other. And what every side agrees on, the only thing that every side agrees on, is that the Jews are to blame for whatever ails them. So it begins with, the Bolsheviks, who have just overthrown the Tsar, overthrown the provisional government that overthrew the Tsar. The Bolsheviks come to power, and they start attacking Jews on the grounds that Jews are capitalists and traders. And in fact, most Jews in Ukraine live in towns and are merchants or small store owners. They really are the capitalist class. They're the middle class in Ukraine. In fact, to the extent that urban areas are often 80 or 90% Jewish, whereas the rural areas are almost 100% Christian. So Jewish residents in Ukraine is scattered throughout Ukraine. They're not concentrated in any one particular region in Ukraine. They're scattered throughout the entire country, but in urban enclaves. So a typical town would be very Jewish in the center of town. And then as you go out into the suburbs, it would have a few more Ukrainians. And then by the time you get to the fields surrounding the town, it's almost 100% Ukrainian. And whether you're in West Ukraine or whether you're in East Ukraine, it's the same situation, that the Jews are in these enclaves throughout Ukraine. They're not concentrated in any one particular region, the way, say, Poles are concentrated in one region, Germans are concentrated in one region, Romanians, Hungarians, all of the other minorities in Ukraine are concentrated, and the Jews are scattered in these urban enclaves. And that means that they are everywhere. There are Jews who are participating in all sides of the conflict, and they're blamed by all sides. So again, the Bolsheviks blame the Jews for being capitalists, and the capitalists blame the Jews for being Bolsheviks and accuse the Jews of all being Bolsheviks. Poland declares its independence, including part of Ukraine. And when Poland declares its independence, the Polish army accuses the Jews of siding with the Ukrainians and attacks them. Ukraine also declares its independence, and segments of the Ukrainian army accuse the Jews of siding with the Poles and attack them. The Germans accuse the Jews of siding with the Russians, and the Russians accuse the Jews of spying for the Germans. Everybody is accusing the Jews of being on other sides. Over time, over the course of a couple of years, the Jews become really associated with the Bolsheviks. And by the end of this 2-year war, by 1919, 1920, all the sides are associating the Jews with the Bolsheviks. And you know what? The Bolsheviks are winning. And this becomes a problem for the Jews because people really, at least opponents of the Bolsheviks, really don't like the Bolsheviks. And so Jews become associated saliently with the Bolsheviks. And one reason is, for one, the head of the Bolsheviks is, of course, Vladimir Lenin, who's not Jewish, but he's sitting in St. Petersburg. But the most visible head of the Bolsheviks is Leon Trotsky. And everybody knows that Trotsky is Jewish. Trotsky is not only the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, but he's also the head of the Red Army. He's the head of the entire military. It's funny, actually, somebody on Facebook just the other day, a relative of mine, posted on Facebook, would our grandparents ever have imagined that a Jew would be leading an army in Ukraine right now? I thought, 100 years ago, yes, a Jew was leading an army in Ukraine, Leon Trotsky. So Trotsky was really the most visible symbol of the revolution. It was well known he was Jewish and or of Jewish background, and his opponents used that against him. Not only Trotsky, by the way, but many of the high-level Bolsheviks in those early years had Jewish ancestry, and particularly those who were sent to negotiate with the West. So those who were the foreign ministers and those who were all of the people who were negotiating with the Germans and the Austrians were almost all Jewish, or women, by the way. The ones who weren't Jewish were women. And this was the world was kind of shocked at this, and they didn't know what was going on. They heard there was a revolution. They didn't know exactly who's leading the revolution. And then these world leaders go to meet with the people who've overthrown the Tsar, and they see it's a bunch of Jews. And so it perpetuated this image of Jews as Bolsheviks. And then the Bolsheviks did something themselves that furthered this association between Jews and Bolsheviks. And what that is they defended Jews. Every army there were all of these different armies fighting in Ukraine. Every army would come in, and as soon as they came into a town, they would round up all of the Jews in the center of town. And usually they would march those Jews to the outskirts of town and they would kill them. And this is how 100,000 Jews got killed. The Bolsheviks did something different. The Bolsheviks moved into a town. They kicked out the bandits who were running the town before and killing Jews. And the Bolsheviks gathered all the Jews into the center of town. And they said to the Jews, we've now saved you and liberated you, and we're going to keep you safe. In return, we ask that you join us and help us liberate the Jews in the next town over. And so Jews said, okay, we'll do that. Jews had discovered before, they had joined self-defense brigades, and they had discovered that these self-defense brigades were so quickly defeated. And in fact, if Jews took up arms, they were more likely to be killed. They realized very quickly. So they stopped with these self-defense brigades and realized far more effective than joining a self-defense brigade was joining the Red Army. And the Red Army would help defend them. And so more and more Jews joined the Red Army, thereby furthering this impression that Jews are connected with the Red Army. So as they moved from town to town, the Red Army became more and more Jewish, and this association between Jews and Bolsheviks snowballed with it. Many of the perpetrators of these pogroms also were young Ukrainian peasants. They were often 14, 15 years old, and they were peasants from the countryside who just came in to kill Jews. We often have accounts from their parents, saying, I told my son not to do this. I don't know why he would do this. I told him to stay in the house. He's going to get in trouble, whatever. But the kids would go and they would terrorize the Jews. These were kids, by the way, 1918, 1919, if they were 15 years old, they had been living under war since the age of 9. World War I was fought in large part over Ukraine. They hadn't sowed fields in 6 years. Instead of their parents going out and plowing the fields, their fathers, instead of plowing fields, had taken up arms and were fighting the Germans. So these are kids who knew only war and also were hungry, were starving. As I said, Jews lived in the center of town. They were the store owners. If you're a peasant and you're starving, where do you get food? You go raid the city, and you raid the dry goods store, you raid the liquor store, you raid the grocery store, and those tended to be owned by Jews. So a lot of these pogroms were also motivated simply by need for food, need for goods. People didn't have clothing, they didn't have leather for boots. So they raid the leather store, the leather works that was also often owned by Jews. They raided the mill and took over the mill that was also often owned by Jews. So much of this is just peasants who are hungry. Anyway, the Bolsheviks come into power. Yeah, go ahead. You have a question?
So one of the theses of your book is that the pogroms foreshadow the extermination of the Jewish people in the Holocaust, and that the pogroms really were not necessarily aimed at, didn't have sort of a strategic purpose, but really just the destruction of Jewry. So can you square that a little bit with what you were just talking about, that they were, just sort of hunt, because you can go in and steal food from a store without killing entire families.
Yeah. So it starts that way. There's a whole bunch of different motivations. So a lot of the pogroms are of that nature, of peasants from the countryside coming in. People defend their stores and often get killed in that way. And then there's a whole nother series of pogroms that are perpetrated by militaries, by military units that are moving through town. So there's different, and I think the book looks at, different styles of pogroms, some of which are really what we would call ethnic riots, and others of which are military actions against the Jews. And it's the military actions ones that I think foreshadow most the Holocaust. But the small ones also play a role in it, these small peasants going, fighting Jews, because it creates this impression that Jews can be attacked. It dehumanizes the Jews in their minds. So if you think a 14-year-old who at one point had gone and perhaps even killed a Jew, a 14-year-old could very well have done that, could have come in with the implements of the countryside, a rifle that he got from his dad that was lying around, gone into town and killed people. That actually happened. 20 years later, that guy's 34, and the Germans come into town, and they say to the Ukrainians, now we need your help killing Jews. That guy could very well volunteer, because for one, he's been living with the guilt of what he did for 20 years, recognizing it. And this is a way of absolving the guilt of having participated in the killings in the first place. It also just inures them to violence. This is something they've done before. Killing a Jew is something they've done. They recognize that when an army comes into town, what it's going to do is it's going to round up all the Jews. So it creates a precedent for the violence that's going to follow. There were also reprisals. The Soviet government cracked down on pogrom perpetrators and punished pogrom perpetrators. So the Soviet government came in and they rounded up these kids, 14, 15, 16 years old, who had committed pogroms, and they killed them. So there's also a lot of anger at that, of people thinking, well, look what the Jews did to us. They're already associating Jews and Bolsheviks. So they saw the Bolshevik revolutionary tribunals that went around killing people who had participated in pogroms as Jewish vengeance. And now they think it's their time to get revenge when the Germans come in. So in any case, there are these difficult relations between the Jews and the Ukrainians between 1918 and 1921. That settles down in the interwar period for about 20 years. But in this period, there is also a major forced famine against all of Ukrainians. About 3.5 million Ukrainians are killed by a forced famine from Stalin that Stalin perpetrates against them. And a lot of Ukrainians blame Jews for that. They continue to associate the Jews with the Bolsheviks. And although Jews have been purged from the Bolshevik leadership at this time, they have very little to do with the famine. Very few Jews are involved with the famine. In fact, Jews suffer from the famine along with Ukrainians. Nevertheless, there's a popular impression that the Jews were among the perpetrators of the famine. And that's also a factor in why Ukrainians are willing to side with the Germans in 41 when the Germans come in. So anyway, the Germans do come in 41. You may know that about 1.5 million Jews were killed in Ukraine during the Holocaust. About a quarter of the total victims of the Holocaust were killed in what is now Ukraine. And they were the first victims of the Holocaust. The first mass killings of the Holocaust took place in Ukraine. Already, the Germans had occupied Poland. They'd established ghettos in Poland, but the Germans were not killing people en masse in Poland. They were putting them in ghettos. They only started killing them en masse in Ukraine and in the rest of the Soviet Union when they came in. And the Germans would move into a town, they would gather up 1,000, 1,500 Jews and massacre them. And the largest of those took place in Kiev the day before Yom Kippur, when 33,000 Jews were rounded up and killed in Babin Yar. And those 33,000 were almost entirely women, children, and the elderly. because the men had already been mobilized into the Red Army to fight. So 33,000 women, children, the elderly, they killed over the course of 36 hours in the ravine of Babin Yar. The ravine, Babin Yar, remained a site of killing, and another 70,000 people were killed over the next 2 years before the Soviet army took back Ukraine.
I think Roger had his hand up.
Yeah.
Take a moment for a quick question and then let you continue. Thank you.
Oh, well, so I was, I had been told, or I don't know where I had heard the story, but I feel like I heard it from several different sources, that the Jews and the Poles, especially the peasantry class, were at odds because the Jews were the money keepers for the nobles and would be collecting, were the ones who faced the poor sections and demanded taxes to pay their taxes. And the Poles were understandably upset about that. And that was sort of an amplifying force. So is that not correct? Are we talking about multiple causes for this, or?
That's true. That's mostly true about actually the Khmelnytsky pogroms that I didn't talk about, which are from the 17th century. So between 1648 and 1649, there was an earlier series of pogroms against Jews in Ukraine, perpetrated by the Cossack Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who's regarded as the father of the Ukrainian state. In the center of Kiev, there's a big statue of Khmelnytsky, and his portrait is on the 5 hryvnia note, the $5 note. So he's the hero, he's the founder of the Ukrainian state, but he also perpetrated atrocities against Jews. And yes, in that case, he perpetrated atrocities against Jews in Ukraine, and it was against Jews because most of the land of Ukraine was owned by these Polish noblemen. And these Polish noblemen owned huge estates, almost like plantations in Ukraine, but the noblemen sat in Warsaw, and they hired Jews to oversee the estates. So when the Ukrainian peasants were rising up against the owners of the estates, they couldn't get to the actual owners who were sitting in Warsaw, and instead turned against the Jews who were the managers of the estates. So that's true. That's about the 17th century pogroms. The ones I'm talking about are a little bit different by then. Tax collection isn't done by individuals, it's done by bureaucracies. Money lending is done by larger banks rather than by individuals. So it's a different system. But it's the same idea, the Jews representing the state, that leads to killings against them. Anyway, I'll just say a couple more things. One is there was a brief time that a Ukrainian state was established in 1918. Right before these pogroms. And it's interesting that this Ukrainian state was a multinational state that promised autonomy to the Jews. And it was celebrated around the world, that Jews around the world saw this new Ukrainian state as a model for what they wanted, because it promised Jews autonomy along the lines of what I had said Shimon Dubnov wanted, and along the lines of what they'd gotten in the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was the right to administer their own affairs separate from the state. There was even a minister of Jewish affairs that was a cabinet-level ministry. So Jews had wide autonomy in Ukraine as Jews. They didn't have to assimilate the way they did in France, for instance. They could stay Jews. They were allowed to continue to speak Yiddish. They were allowed to get state funding in Yiddish. They were allowed to go to court in Yiddish, for instance. And it was a different type of emancipation. It was emancipation as a collective unit rather than as individuals. And it fell apart very quickly within a few months, fell apart in violence. But it's interesting that Ukraine gave Jews at one point, for a brief couple months is all the state lasted, but they gave Jews wider autonomy than they had ever had in any other modern state. So there's both sides of this Ukraine thing. You know, there's a lot of violence against Jews, but there's also a lot of flourishing of Jewish life. And, you know, as you know now, just to skip ahead, Ukraine now has a Jewish president. When he became president, there was also a Jewish prime minister. And more remarkable, nobody cared at the time. It was never an issue in the campaign. Once he became president, you know, the Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post and the Jewish news and, you know, all over America was talking about how interesting it is that Ukraine has a Jewish president. Nobody in Ukraine cared. And that's significant. I think far more significant than the fact that they got a Jewish president is the fact that nobody cared that he was Jewish. And that's a radical transformation in Ukraine that's happened really over the last 5 years or so since he became president. He became president in 2019 with 73% of the vote. I mean, a remarkable achievement. There were 39 different people running for president. And there was a runoff election between him and Petro Poroshenko, and he beat Petro Poroshenko, the former president, with 73% of the vote. And Poroshenko conceded, turned over power, and right now Poroshenko himself is leading a military brigade fighting for Zelensky in the streets of, I think he's in Kharkiv now. You know, so imagine that. Imagine even in the United States, us having an election, the president conceding and going to war in the streets to fight for the next president of the opposing party. So Ukraine has become a real, genuine democracy, really in the last few years. Before that, it was struggling with corruption, still struggles with corruption, but they've made headway. And I mean, it's just remarkable the transformation that Zelensky has overseen. And in fact, as you know, we had a presidential impeachment here because Zelensky wasn't corrupt, right? The American government wanted him to open up a corrupt investigation into Hunter Biden, and he refused to do that. He refused to overrule the legal process. And as a result, we had an impeachment here. So it's actually, he's been able to stand strong against corruption. He, in Zelensky's inauguration speech, he famously said, in Ukraine, every building, every federal building has a picture of the president in it. It's one of those countries, where there's always a picture of the president behind the post office. Every classroom had a picture of the president. Every official building, every office had a picture of the president. And in his inauguration speech, Zelensky said, I want everybody in an official position to take down the picture of the president that's in your office and instead to put up a picture of your family. And whenever you make a decision, I want you to look at that picture and I want you to think about who you're actually working for. It's a symbolic gesture, a symbolic statement, but boy, is it important to say something like that. And for those of you who don't know, Zelensky was a comedian before. He'd been to Israel many times. His show is on Netflix, Servant of the People, which is the name of his TV show. And Servant of the People, I don't know if you know this, but it's about a school teacher who goes on a rant against the government, and then that rant goes viral on YouTube or whatever, and he ends up becoming president. So Zelensky plays a president in the show, and is now, I mean, that's actually happened in real life. So anyway, so that's where we are now, and I'm happy to take any questions or anything.
Let me ask you. I'll start off, and then be happy to take some questions in the chat as well, or people can come off of mute. We have a curious congregation. To what do you attribute the this strong move towards democracy? Because I was listening to a talk given by Yuval Harari, who spoke about the thing that Putin did not anticipate was the fierce rejection by the Ukrainian people of the Russian invasion. To what do you attribute this move towards democracy and this toleration of Jews and and sort of celebration that's taken place?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it in the, I started going there in about 2002, I think was the first time I went to Ukraine. I'd been to Russia many times before that and spent time there. And the difference was astounding, actually. The difference in young people and how much they want to be part of the West. In Russia, you still heard suspicion of the West. There's still a Russian, national idea that differentiates them from the West. Whereas in Ukraine, everybody wanted to be Europe. And suddenly you could see every store was called, the Euro this, the Euro deli, the Euro restaurant, the, Parisian, Paris, clothing store. And you could just kind of tell there was a change taking place around the mid to late 2000s, where everybody wanted to be Europe. People started to use the euro in addition to the dollar. That was also significant. Although they're not a euro country, but people as a secondary currency, people were using the euro. And you could just see this and feel it. People were also very engaged in politics. I've been to Russia during elections, and you wouldn't know there was an election going on, because for one, it doesn't matter. I've been to Ukraine during elections, even before the 2019 election, and everybody was motivated. There's signs everywhere. There's, every car has signs on the car. People are wearing pins and buttons. So it was a very politically engaged country. It's a young country and a country that's looking to the West and that wants to be a part of Europe. There's an older elite that's still pro-Russian, and there's an older wealthy elite that's pro-Russian. But even the Russian speakers want to be part of Europe. My driver, when I'm there, I work with a driver, chauffeur. He's a Russian speaker, but a Ukrainian patriot by all means. But his first language is Russian, and this transformation that you can be a Russian speaker and still be a Ukrainian. Even Jews would never describe themselves as Ukrainian. They'd be Jews living in Ukraine, but they wouldn't be Ukrainian until the last 5 years or so, where suddenly Jews in Ukraine are starting to describe themselves as Ukrainian, because Ukraine has had two revolutions in the last 15 years, 2004, the Orange Revolution, and 2014, Maidan Revolution. And literally revolutions, right, where they overthrew the government, where tens of thousands of people came out onto the streets for months on end and managed to overthrow the government. And that creates a strong sense of identity in them. And I think they feel that they have fought for this freedom. They fought for democracy. They fought against corruption. They died for it and lived in the streets for it. They value it. And the young people value it, and they valorize those who went to the streets to fight for it. Putin knows this. And, one thing Putin is right about is that Russians and Ukrainians actually do have a lot in common. They're very similar people. They speak similar languages. They have similar cuisines. They know similar TV shows and movies and what have you. So Putin knows if democracy can work so successfully in Ukraine, it can work in Russia. And he's well aware of that and the danger of it spreading to Russia. He claims he went into Ukraine to fight Nazism. He did not go into Ukraine to fight Nazism. He's not afraid of Nazism. He's afraid of democracy and what it can do to him and what it can do to the powerful elite in Russia. Because boy, the powerful elite in Ukraine have been humbled. The Yanukovych gang that, Yanukovych was the former president who had to flee to Russia. And by the way, of course, this isn't the first time that Russia has gone after Ukrainian Democrats. Zelensky is not the first real Democrat to run Ukraine. Yushchenko was the first. And as you recall, Yushchenko is the one who was poisoned by Russia and, got the pockmarked face. So that was another attempt by Russia to kill the president of Ukraine because he was Western oriented. So Ukraine is a country that wants to be Western oriented right now. And Russia's not allowing it.
And somebody asked in the chat that what is the dominant language? Is it still Russian or do most people speak Ukrainian, or is it both?
The dominant language now is Ukrainian. Most people speak Ukrainian, and most of the Russian speakers also speak Ukrainian. They're bilingual. In parts of Ukraine, the parts closest to Russia, Russian is still a very common second language or even first language. When you go west, actually, Polish is more likely to be the second language. Older people also all learned Russian in school and know Russian. The younger people now, they don't know Russian, they know Polish as their second language. Again, further evidence that they're looking towards the West. But there's been a change even in the last 15 years since I've been going there, where people a little bit younger than me are gonna know Polish and Ukrainian, and people a little bit older than me are gonna know Russian and Ukrainian predominantly.
Let me turn to Mike, and if Mike Resnick can figure, he got himself off of mute. And Mike and Jackie, it's great to see both of you. Mike, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, this has to do a little bit with the formalities of the governments in terms of dealing with Jews. So in Russia, I knew when I was visiting there many times in the 90s, I think Jews still had Jew written in their passports. And has that formality continued? And did that formality carry over to Ukraine? So was there always a formal government establishment of what a Jew was, and is determined by the passport? And along with that, with this identification of being Jewish in these countries, do you anticipate an increase in anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so the passport issue is an interesting issue. During Soviet times, the Soviet Union didn't regard itself as a nationality, right? So the Soviet Union thought of itself as a multinational state, a communist state, encompassing 150 different nationalities. So one of the questions on a passport, along with, gender and name and whatever, place of birth, was nationality. And everybody had this number 5 on their passports saying what their nationality was. And some people were Russian, some were Ukrainian, some were Uzbek, some were Abkhaz, whatever the case may be, and some were Jews. So Jew was regarded as a nationality. It's hard for Americans to understand, because in America, your nationality is American, right? You are living in the US and your nationality is the same as your citizenship. But in Russia, or in the Soviet Union anyway, citizenship and nationality meant something different. Nationality meant your ethnic origins. So there was this item number 5 on the passport that said you're Jewish. Ukraine had the same thing because it was part of the Soviet Union. Since the Ukrainian independence, it doesn't have that anymore, nor does the new Russia. They now regard themselves as nation states, as your nationality is the same as your citizenship, in theory. And in fact, that's why we don't even really know how many Jews there are in Ukraine. The last census in Ukraine was 2001, and it counted 103,000 Jews. I estimate that the numbers now are about 40,000 who identify as Jewish, and probably 3 or 4 times that number who would be considered Jewish according to halakha or according to Israel's law of return. There was another part of your question I've forgotten.
Yeah, the other question is, thinking about Zelensky being Jewish, do you think this sort of thing will contribute to any rise in anti-Semitism?
Yeah, who knows? That's the $1 million question. I hope not, but I recognize from what I've studied that often Jews get blamed. And Zelensky's been quiet about his Jewishness. As I say, it's never been an issue. Until now, until the last week or so, when he's been talking about it much more extensively. And he's been doing that for good strategic reasons, because he wants to get Jews around the world on his side and wants to combat this notion. It's a very effective way of combating the notion that he's a Nazi, which is what Putin is calling him. So he's been utilizing that a lot more. He made a big deal about this shrapnel, the shelling that may have fallen on Babin Yar, and even wrote an appeal to the Jews of the world in Hebrew. That does concern me a little bit. I'd rather him keep the Jewish stuff a little bit on the, be mum on the Jewish stuff. It also worries me a little bit on the other side. There are, again, Jews on all sides of this conflict. Putin himself is not Jewish, but those oligarchs, a lot of the oligarchs that are backing him are of Jewish ethnicity, really a lot of them. And particularly 2 of them from Ukraine, 2 of the major ones from Ukraine, Vekselberg and Michal Friedman, are both Jewish from Ukraine. Roman Abramovich, who was just sanctioned by the UK today, is proudly Jewish. And in fact, I think it was Yad Vashem even petitioned the United States government against sanctioning him because he's given so much money to Yad Vashem. So I do have concerns about there being Jews on both sides again. And to make it even more obvious, Naftali Bennett has to be the mediator, right? He's going in, shuttling back and forth. And, God bless him. I hope that he can, mediate a peace. But if it fails, I kind of, a part of me says, this is not about the Jews. Can't the Jews just stay out of this one and see what happens? So yeah, I am concerned about that. And it would not surprise me if Putin changes his rhetoric very soon and starts talking about the Jews taking over Ukraine instead of the Nazis. He did that, by the way, in 2014. In 2014, when he was combating the Maidan revolution, he told international audiences that the Ukrainian revolution was being led by Nazis, but he told domestic audiences that it was being led by Jews. So we'll see what comes of that.
There's a question in the chat, or a couple of them. Let me just throw them out there. First of all, and I know you're more a historian than a policy analyst, but someone is curious, based on your experience and knowledge, what do you think needs to happen to get Putin to back down? Another question, and I'll review these for you. Somebody wanted you to say something about today's Chernowitz. And and a third one, I'll just read this comment. Over the last several days, I've read your most recent book and have felt rather depressed and started feeling less hopeful for humanity at large.
How do you think it felt to write it?
Right. Hearing you today has helped. Thank you for sharing with us. And then the last question I'll read here: in the Soviet Union's passports, was it self-identification that led to Jewish on the passport? Did many Jews use Russian on the passport?
Yeah, so the passport issue is the easiest one. It was based on what your parents were, which was based on what their parents were. So it was very difficult to get to not have Jew on your passport. And people, Jews were discriminated against in the Soviet Union. So people definitely wanted to not have Jew on their passport, but they didn't have control over it because they could just look at what was on the parents' passport. So they didn't have much say in it. What would it take to get Putin to back down? That's I wish I had the answer to that question. And for those of you who have read my book, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I'm a pessimist for good reason. I'm a historian of Ukraine, and that leads many people to become a pessimist. I don't think Putin's going to back down. I don't think he's going to back down. I think he's incapable of backing down at this point. The best tweet I've seen is, can't we just fast forward to the part where he kills himself in the bunker? And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I don't think he's going to back down. My hope is that there will be military rebellions against him. My hope is that Russian soldiers will stop following his orders and Russian police will stop following his orders. And that's the only thing that can happen. The oligarchs aren't going to turn against him. I don't see that happening. I could be wrong. He's not going to back down willingly. I think these dictators, you have to take at their word, oddly enough. And when they say they're going to do something, no matter how ridiculous or terrible it sounds, you have to believe that they're going to do it. So when Putin was talking about invading Ukraine and taking over Ukraine, there were a lot of analysts who thought, nah, he's just going to go after the Donetsk and Lugansk areas. He's not actually going to go into Ukraine proper. He can't actually be thinking that he's going to bring 190,000 troops into Ukraine, and he did. And I think when Putin is talking about nuclear weapons, you have to take him seriously at that too. Right now, he's recognized that he can't win militarily the way he intended to. So he is indiscriminately bombing civilian targets. This is what he did in Syria. It's what he did in Chechnya. And it's now what he's doing in Ukraine. He'll continue to escalate. And I think he will continue to escalate until he is somehow stopped, and he's not going to stop willingly. What was the other? Chernowitz.
Today's Chernowitz.
Yeah, Chernowitz is a beautiful city. Near Romania. I don't know if the person who asked has been there, but it was a city with a large Jewish population. Still has a small Jewish population. It's a gorgeous city. Right now, it is safe. It's far enough west that it's quite safe, and I think it would be a long time, if at all, that Russia is able to occupy it. But it's a beautiful city. If you haven't been there, I would highly recommend going once, hopefully, God willing, things calm down there. Were there any other ones? The depression, yeah, it is depressing. And it's depressing to write about. I hope that those of you who haven't read the book will read the book, because I think you can learn a lot about what's going on, and you can learn about how things work in that part of the world from reading the book. And yeah, it is depressing, and it doesn't end well. I can ruin the ending for you. It doesn't all get better at the end.
Roger has his hand up to ask a question. We'll take a couple more and then we'll wrap up for today. He's going to come off of mute, lower left-hand corner, the microphone.
Got it. Thanks.
There we go.
Yeah, so I was talking once with a friend who identifies with being Ukrainian, and we were talking about history, and all of a sudden he mentions the name Chmielewski. Am I pronouncing that right? The
Chmielewski.
Chmielewski, yeah. And he says, "Oh, I know," and then all of a sudden it's like, I know this guy. He's the terror of, well, he's the second worst Jew in the history of Jews. And then my friend says, "No, he's not. He's a hero. This is a great man. He's the only man that liberated all of the Ukraine." And so there's just how different. It was just a great lesson for me in terms of how people can identify the same facts and then just turn them in totally different ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people in Ukraine. There's a lot of heroes of Ukraine that have committed atrocities against Jews. Not only Chmielewski. There's recently been big controversies over Stepan Bandera, who was a proponent of Ukrainian independence during World War II, but he sided with the Nazis. And in some ways, that's understandable. Ukraine had just suffered. 3.5 million people had been starved to death by Russia. Russia was oppressing Ukraine in all types of ways. They were looking for independence and doing anything whatsoever to try to get independence. And Bandera sided with Hitler in the hopes that Germany would give Ukraine independence. In the end, Germany didn't, and Germany actually imprisoned Bandera, because the last thing they had known, the Germans thought of the Ukrainians as only slightly above the Jews. So they didn't want Ukrainian independence either. It was a huge mistake of Bandera's. But in those circumstances, I can understand why he allied with Hitler. It was a bad choice, and I wish he hadn't. And I wouldn't lionize him. I wouldn't erect statues of him in the center of Lviv like the Ukrainians have done. But their doing so is not because he was an ally of Hitler. It's just contested histories. Simon Petlura, who was the president of Ukraine at the time of the pogroms that I write about, is a similar problem. He's lionized by the Ukrainians, but hated by the Jews. And that too, I don't think he instigated pogroms. He didn't do enough to stop them, but he didn't instigate them. These people are just more complicated than we imagine them to be. And it's hard to, and there's contested histories. We have that in the United States too, right? We have had our fights over monuments and memorials and who we should lionize and whose statues should be up of. I gotta say, I think in Ukraine, they're a lot more complex than they are in America, to be honest, at least for some of them. I don't see who, some of these Civil War Confederate heroes, I don't see who they were heroes of today. Whereas in Ukraine, I actually see a legitimate Ukrainian fight for independence against Soviet rule. That is a much more contested history there.
We'll take from Michaela, and I'll finish up with one question, and then we'll wrap up our time. You've been very, very generous. Michaela?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's fascinating. You touched a little bit about those Jewish poets and authors, and really very, very prominent. And so many of them really followed the Zionist movement, and they came to Israel at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were really the cornerstone of the revival of Jewish culture, poetry, literature in the state of Israel. And they came from a very rich background. Many of them went to yeshivas and they were knowledgeable about the Bible, about Judaism, and they created they were very prominent in the revival of the English Hebrew language. So I just wanted to add this one.
Yeah, and I'll just add as well, it's not only the poets, but the politicians. I forgot to mention Jabotinsky was Ukrainian, and well, was born in Ukraine and formulated much of his thought in Ukraine, in Odessa during the revolution. Golda Meir was born in Ukraine and still continued to affiliate with Ukraine quite extensively. So the political leaders of Israel too. Yeah.
Let me just wrap up by going back to the perilous situation I think that Israel finds itself in. Many people are seeing what's happening with Ukraine as very parallel with Israel as a country fighting for its independence and sort of trying to represent the Ukrainian nationality, and there are forces within Israel, and I think even popular sentiment really urging Israel's political leaders to come out in favor of Ukraine and against Russia. And Russia controls a lot of the area in Syria, which is critical for keeping Iran from putting missiles in the north of Israel. And so Bennett, has ended up, trying to thread this needle and even act as a mediator. And I just, wanted to hear your reflections. To what extent do you think the comparison is fair? What are the similarities between sort of Ukrainian national independent movement and something like Zionism, and what are the perils that Israel faces in navigating this moment?
Yeah, well, Jabotinsky was actually the first to do that. Jabotinsky was a huge supporter of Ukrainian independence in 1919, on the grounds that he saw Ukrainians and Jews as parallel peoples. And a lot of others have made that argument too, that both of them are peoples who have suffered incredible oppression. By all means, the Ukrainians have suffered oppression under the Tsars, and then subsequently under the Soviet government, and now are victims of this terrible war. So a lot of people have made that comparison. The issue that Israel has to manage is this delicate balance that Israel also has a very large Russian-speaking population, many of whom are sympathetic to what's going on in Russia, many of whom only watch Russian media, only read Russian newspapers, and they're promoting a very Russian view of this. They think that Ukraine is a land of Nazis and that Russia is crushing the Nazis in Ukraine. I get this. I've written a bunch of articles over the last few weeks in the Forward and in PBS and Smithsonian Magazine and various other places. And I see in the comments section that there are Russians who think that Ukraine is a country full of Nazis. So there's Russians in Israel who think that as well. So Israel kind of has to maintain this delicate balance, not to mention Israel also has to be careful about the sanctions regime, because the sanctions that we're seeing against Russia right now are unparalleled. Never have sanctions been imposed on a country like this. And I think Israel is very aware that they could be next, that there have been instances when many countries around the world have been objecting to things that Israel is doing. They've had resolutions against them in the United Nations repeatedly. And I think they are also aware of those possibilities. So, so I think it's Israel has to, as always, Israel has to walk a very delicate balance in this. One of the reasons why I kind of wish it wasn't Bennett who was shuttling back and forth, and I wish we could let France do that or something. Let France get in the middle of this conflict and let us just sit out of it for once. But I recognize it'd be great if he does negotiate something. I saw you put the link to that tablet magazine. So you can all read that, and you can also all read the book. Maybe I'll put a link.
Well,
to
that's
the book.
what I was going to finish by just saying a couple of things. First of all, tremendous thanks to you for taking time, really doing this at the spur of the moment. I've learned that you can do a round of applause like this, right? As something on Zoom. And thank you for putting into. I did put the article in tablet, but I want to encourage everybody to buy the book and to read it. I'm partway through. It is it's hard. It may not leave you with a true sense of optimism, but it's important for us to have a sense of the history and the deep history of the people in that region. And I also want to just share with everyone, when I reached out to Professor Veidlinger, I asked him about his fee, and he immediately said, I would much prefer, rather than you paying a fee to me, I would rather you make a big donation to the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, for their relief efforts. And Bethel indeed will be making a $1,000 donation to the JDC between the Rabbi's Discretionary Fund and the Lifelong Learning Committee. And I also want to just encourage all of us, whether it's through the JDC or the Jewish Federations of North America, the Masorti movement. Jeff may not know this. I was the director of Camp Ramah in California. The Ramah movement has had a camp in Ukraine for many years. The Masorti movement is there. There are a lot of people doing important work, literally life-saving work with the huge refugee crisis that's taking place there. And I would encourage all of us to be involved as much as we can. And thanks.
I just want to say I put in another link for a Ukrainian organization, Ukrainian civil society organization, not affiliated with the Jewish community, but that if you want to go that route as well. But I would encourage you, they need help. I've been speaking to my friends in Ukraine. They desperately need our help. So I hope you can all help them.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're all looking for ways to help most effectively. So we appreciate that. Okay. Everybody, thank you very, very much for coming out. And we will continue to, continue to pray for peace and to work for peace. I'll also share with you, just very briefly, there's a member of our community whose daughter, of the Bethel community, whose daughter actually recently escaped from Ukraine. She was visiting with her birth family there, and she was able to escape from Ukraine. And we're talking with the family about their comfort in terms of sharing that story with us. But this is not just a story happening halfway around the world, but really ones that has connections to our own community and that will have ripples on our world for months and years to come. So, Professor Veidlinger, thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Pleasure meeting you all, and thanks for coming out and hearing me.
Okay.
All the best.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.